So briefly, what have you said?
Yes.
What have you said briefly?
I said that Jehovah's Witnesses are generally sincere people. We didn't come here to condemn them, but we have the same affection toward them as Apostle Paul toward Jews of the first century, which were sincere and zealous, but misled in their understanding of true worship of God. And now we would like to hear what you have to say.
Yes. I think that's very important, is to recognize the sincere desire that most Jehovah's Witnesses have. They do want to serve God. They want to serve Christ. They want to help people. But they have a certain mentality that has been developed in them that leads them to think in certain patterns only. And they need to become free from that. And that's what we can do, is to help them to see the reality of the Scripture. My father became associated with the Watchtower organization in the year 1913, and he was baptized in that year. My mother shortly after that. I was born in 1922, 85 years ago, and so from my childhood on, that was all that I knew was Jehovah's Witnesses. But when I reached my teenage years, I stopped attending the meetings, and my parents didn't oblige me to go. But I reached a point where I realized that my life was very empty. It had no purpose to it. So one night I saw my parents getting dressed up, and I thought they might be going to the cinema. So I asked them where they were going, thinking I could go along to the cinema. They said, "No, we're going to the meeting. Do you want to come along?" And I said, "No." So my father talked to me very frankly, and he said, "Raymond, why do you think you're going to survive Armageddon? You're not doing anything." He says, "These people that go to that church in the corner do more than you. You don't even do what they're doing. Why do you think God is going to spare you at Armageddon?" This was a real shock to me. My father had never spoken to me in that way. And so I went into another room and closed the door and cried. I came back out and I said, "I'll go with you tonight." What I can say is, of that one meeting, it caused me to renew my interest in the Bible. So I continued my association, and in the year 1940, when I graduated from high school, I decided to enter the pioneer work, to spend my whole time in the service of the organization. So for 40 more years, my entire time was devoted to the organization and the work of the organization. I spent over 20 years in the Caribbean islands, particularly Puerto Rico and the Dominican Republic. And I experienced different diseases, and I lived with the people. I traveled around and I lived in their homes, ate their food. And in the Dominican Republic, I faced many dangers. There was a dictatorship there, and people who didn't agree with the dictator were often just disappeared. So I never knew whether something was going to happen to me. So in my own case, I know that I was sincere, that I really wanted to do what was right. I wanted to serve God, and I was willing to undergo different persecutions and difficulties on behalf of the people. So I don't doubt my sincerity, and I believe that God recognized that. So as Shimon has said, we have to acknowledge that Jehovah's Witnesses are sincere, and as Paul said of the Jews, "I bear them witness, they have a zeal for God, but not with understanding." If we go back to the first century, we find that the idea of worship being something very formalized and very systematized, that is not to be found there. The term that is often rendered church in many translations is the Greek word ecclesia. But it doesn't refer to what people commonly speak of today when they talk about a church. It wasn't even a religious term. Ecclesia was not a religious term. It was a secular term. It appears in Acts, the 19th chapter, when it tells about Paul's experience where he showed the people that they should not put their trust in gods and goddesses. And in this town where he was, there were many silversmiths, and they made images to this goddess. And so they were afraid that what he was saying would cause their business to suffer ruin. And it tells that they met in assembly, and it uses this Greek word, ecclesia. So they didn't meet in a church, in a building, or something like that. They just met as a group. So when they met in the first century, they didn't have certain buildings that they went to. They met in homes. In fact, history shows that for the first 3 centuries, Christians met always in homes. There was an entire letter written called the Letter to the Hebrews, and it was directed to Jews who were becoming interested in Christianity. And it helped these Jewish people to change their thinking, and it was a tremendous transition that they had to make. They were used to their worship that was centralized on the temple. They had a priesthood who wore special garments to distinguish them. There were many rituals and different sacrifices with a sacred altar, and all this was now to change. And this change was so great that this entire letter is to prepare them for this and to help them to see how now everything centers in Christ Jesus. And in this letter, the writer shows that all the things that had existed in the nation of Israel, the priesthood, the law, the temple, the altar, all those things were just shadows of greater things to come, and they're all fulfilled in Christ Jesus, who is the high priest. For example, with regard to the altar, the letter says in Hebrews chapter 13, "Our altar is one from which the priests of the sacred tent have no right to eat. As you know, those animals whose blood is brought as a sin offering by the high priest into the sanctuary have their bodies burned outside the camp. And therefore Jesus also suffered outside the gate to consecrate the people by his own blood." And he says, "Through Jesus, therefore, let us continually offer up to God the sacrifice of praise, that is the tribute of lips, which acknowledge his name, and never forget to show kindness and to share with what you have with others, for such are the sacrifices which God approves." So there was no physical altar, and even the temple, this letter shows that the temple was figurative of something far greater, which relates to the heavens. So to adjust their thinking from all these physical objects that they were used to and see everything from a spiritual viewpoint was a tremendous change for them. There's a book called Paul's Idea of Community, the history of the church houses, and the Australian author, he's a scholar named Robert Banks. He makes the point, he says, when Christians gathered, it was not gathering to worship, because their worship was something they did every day and all day long. And the Apostle Paul says the same thing in Romans chapter 12. He says, "Let us offer our bodies as a living sacrifice to God." So this spiritual altar that we serve before, we give these spiritual sacrifices, and they involve our whole self, our heart, mind, everything that we are. So we need to keep that in mind always when we think about worship, and realize that it is not something we do a certain day of the week or certain times of the week or certain places, but it involves the whole life. It involves everything that we have, everything that we are is involved in our worship. And it's interesting that the disciple James makes a similar point in the 2nd chapter of his letter. And
I suppose here.
yes, in the 1st chapter, rather, and beginning in verse 26, he says, "A man may think he is religious, but if he does not have control over his tongue, he is deceiving himself. That man's religion is futile. The kind of religion which is without stain or fault in the sight of God our Father, is this, to go to the help of our orphans and widows in their distress, and keep oneself untarnished from the world. And the word religion there is the Greek word latreia, which in the New World Translation of Jehovah's Witnesses is rendered sacred service. And they are told, we were all told, that sacred service involved going from door to door, witnessing, or attending meetings, or serving at the branch office or something like this, but nothing else was considered sacred service, just those things. So we had this very narrow view of what it was to serve God, and if we come to a knowledge of the truth, we'll see that it embraces many things, and it's something that we can have in mind and carry out every day and all day long. Now, do we want to have questions at any time?
There is a question if there is some connection between Jehovah's Witnesses and Christadelphians, because a brother, he's a former witness, he left the organization and he started reading eschatological publications of Christadelphians, and he found some similar interpretations. Is there any connection?
Well, there are many different religions that have a similar background to Jehovah's Witnesses. When Charles Taze Russell started the Watchtower magazine, he had become interested in what is called the Second Advent movement. And there are many other religions that came from that movement back in the 1800s. The best known is the Seventh-day Adventists. But there are many other smaller and less known religions. One is the Church of God of the Abrahamic Faith, and it came from the same source, the Second Advent movement, which was started by a man named William Miller. And he had said that the coming of Christ was due to take place in that time, and he fixed on certain dates, including the date 1874, and gave prophecies too about the fulfillment of the times of the Gentiles as applying in that period. So when you see similarity between the teachings of Jehovah's Witnesses and some of these religions, often if you go back far enough, you'll find that they had a connection with that movement of the Second Adventists under William Miller. Okay.
How do the Watchtower organization reconciled two opposite concepts? They prophesied by the mouth of Rutherford that the end would come in the 40s. And formerly they thought that before the Armageddon, the princes would be resurrected. How that they could reconcile that opposite opinions?
I know that in the 1940s I attended a convention. When I came home and summer ended and I put away my summer clothes, I told myself I probably will never take these out again, because by the time next summer comes, I will probably be in a prison or the Armageddon will have come. So I really thought that it was that close. But it came and it went. And later on they advanced the date of 1975. But they say, well, this just shows that we're very sincere. We really want to see the end come. Most people aren't that sincere. They're apathetic. But we have such intense desire that that's the reason we have settled on these dates. They often refer to the book of Acts where it says that the disciples meeting with Christ asked him if it was at that time that he was going to take his power and begin to reign. And they say that they are doing the same thing as those disciples did, that the disciples had a mistaken idea, but what they did was not improper. But there's no genuine parallel at all between the two things. The disciples were simply asking for enlightenment. They didn't set a certain date and then predict this date and then announce it all over the world for people to believe and tell people that they should believe it, that the end was going to come at that time. It's very, very different from what the disciples did. But this is the way they excuse themselves from having set these dates, which never produced anything. Okay.
Yes. I'm more interested, says brother, in more practical things. I was a Jehovah's Witness for 10 years, and later I converted to Jesus Christ, and I was spiritually rebirthed. And I am interested, how do you help people to be freed from the wrong pattern of thinking? How do you preach them the gospel of Jesus Christ?
It's very important that we not be like so many former witnesses. If you go on the internet, you'll find different websites about Jehovah's Witnesses. But most all of them are very, very negative. It's all attacking, and saying negative things about the witnesses. And that doesn't accomplish good. What we need to do is focus on the positive things and show that there's something better. There was an elderly German couple that I knew in California, and when I came back from the Dominican Republic, he began writing to me, and he and his wife have been very active as witnesses. They were either pioneering or they were putting in 60, 70, 80 hours a month in the field service. And he was an elder from the very beginning of the elder arrangement. And later, after many years, in 1980, when I left the Brooklyn headquarters of the organization and later moved to Alabama and was there disfellowshipped, I wrote to this brother. I told him what had happened, and I said, "You may decide you don't want to communicate with me anymore. And if so, why, I'll respect your wishes in that regard. But I want you to know that whatever you decide, my appreciation of you as people will always be the same. I'll always have affection for you." I was surprised he kept on writing. And so over the years, we exchanged many letters. And when I wrote to him, I never wrote things attacking the organization or focusing on negative things about the organization. I abstained from doing any of that. But sometimes he would say in his letter certain expressions. He might say how tired he was, how weary he was, because of the constant pressure that he experienced. And I would use that opportunity then to discuss things from the Bible about we are saved by faith and not by works, and what that means. And that as Christians we will have works, but they are something that proceed from our heart. They're not something that is dictated to us and some kind of a system or routine that we're called upon to follow. Or he would say other things that would allow me to discuss with him the Bible teaching that we're not under law, we're under God's gracious kindness. So discussing that, it would help him to see the difference between the legalisms of the organization and the freedom that Christians enjoy. So after some time, he came to conclusions on his own and from reading the Bible, not because I had attacked the organization. He called me by telephone one day, and spontaneously he said, "You know, these people, they worship the big O." And by that he meant the organization. They worship the big O. So he came to that conclusion on the basis of what he had read in the scriptures, and not because of my trying to tear down the Watchtower organization. As the Apostle Peter says, we should be like Jesus, that when he was insulted, he didn't retaliate with insults, and he didn't render evil for evil. And the apostolic teaching is that we should conquer evil with good. And if we emphasize the beautiful nature of Christian freedom and how superior it is to living a life that is dictated to us and following a certain routine, why many people will begin to realize that there is something better there for them.
Proszę bardzo.
And may I ask you, I have two questions. First, what do you think about the future of the Watchtower organization? I mean, 20, 50 years. Will it be still so orthodoxy, or more friendly for other religions and more tolerant for people inside the organization? And second question is more important for me. I was born as Jehovah's Witnesses child. I was strong in faith more or less in my 25-year birthday. When I lost my faith in the Watchtower organization, I lost my faith in God too. My question, how I should find a way back to God after this experience with Watchtower organization?
That is a problem that the witnesses face because during their life in that organization, they were taught they had the truth. They spoke of being in the truth. But we need to realize that the source of truth is not some organization, but it is God and His Son and His Word. So if a man has a messenger and he sends out this messenger, and the messenger says things that are contrary to what the man who sent him said, then the fault is with the messenger, not with the one who sent him. So if someone comes and tells us, I represent so-and-so, and then tells us many things that the person is supposed to have said, and
Continue.
if he claims he represents someone and speaks for him, but then says many things that really are not, that didn't come from that person, and we find out they're false, who's to blame? Is it the person who was lied about, or is it the messenger who gave a false representation? So as the Apostle John says, God is light, and in Him there is no darkness at all. So any falsehoods did not proceed from Him, because He's not the source of falsehood, but of truth. I think the best thing for people to do is to take the Bible and begin reading it by themselves, and I would recommend that they get a different translation. It's not that the New World Translation is a bad translation, but it's so worded that it's designed to create a certain picture in witnesses' minds, and when they read it, those words color their thinking. So if they read the Scriptures in some other translation and decide from the beginning they're going to let the Bible speak for itself, they will often find that the Bible becomes like a new book to them, and they begin to see things they'd never seen before. I've had many people who write to me and say that that's been their experience. But faith is something that we have to allow to develop in our heart. It's not something that somebody can give to us or can pass on to us. It has to originate with us and in our heart.